Hi there, I'm John from CNCKing.com, and today we make custom Acacia plaques. There's quite a few steps involved with making these custom Acacia plaques. The first one is buying the laminated Acacia, of course. I could technically laminate it here in the shop, but it's more cost effective to actually buy it when it's already done like this for this specific project here, based on the specs that it was. Now, what you see here is a router. So the router cut out the shape, and the router also did this part here, the outline. And then I used the laser to do the engraving on the inside. Now, the reason why I chose to use the router to do this instead of the laser, because the router is a far more cost-effective machine to do that. And more importantly, the router has Z-axis feedback, which means that it always knows where it is, X, Y, and Z, which is the depth. With the laser, it just has X and Y, and I have to sort of guesstimate the Z. Now, the problem with that is the laser doesn't know how deep it's going, and the depth is dependent on the density of the wood. So for a laser engraving like this, you won't really notice it. But for something like here, where it's darker wood, let's just say that's denser, and here you have lighter wood where it's less dense, what would happen is that I get less deep where it's dark, and I get deeper where it's white, and that kind of stuff. So on small little things like that, you don't really notice, but on larger sort of plaques like this or larger items, you notice the differences in depth, and there's no real way around getting a perfectly consistent depth. So that's why we did it that way. Like welding and every other fabrication system out there, if you're starting off with a platform that's not flat, that's not level, and that's not square, it's very, very difficult to produce something that is flat, level, and square. Now, a lot of people have questions about finish, and they don't realize that most finishes that you apply over wood, and other things as well, but we'll just concentrate on wood here, are only maybe a 1/16 deep, a 32nd deep. They don't penetrate deep into the wood unless you're using a wood that has a very high porosity that just drinks a lot of stuff. Think of MDF, that's a good example of that. So as a result, this piece of wood here already had a surface varnish on it. It's actually pretty tough. And to do this project properly, I need to remove that. Because when you do the laser engraving, you're going into the wood and therefore need to sand off all the smoke. It's very hard to sand when you have a varnish over it because the varnish just gets into the sandpaper and quickly just makes it garbage, and nothing really is achieved. So that's why you saw me with the router at first, and what I did was remove the varnish, so that's no longer part of the equation for this project here. And as soon as I do that, then I can produce the blanks for the fire marshal plaques, and then as soon as that's done, I'm all set to do the laser engraving, and then I can do the sanding. So it's a very straightforward process, but the varnish must be removed first before anything is done. And before that's done, I gotta make sure that I'm working off a flat parallel and totally perfect surface to work from, so that when I do the surfacing, everything is flat. Otherwise, you end up with machining marks across the surface, and that's really hard to sand even and flush and flat as well. So just to show you the difference in contrast between the unfinished and finished. So it's quite a difference. And I just use normal tung oil. I found that works totally fine for the vast majority of the projects I do here in the shop. And Acacia just drinks it up, it's great. So what it involves is a couple coats. After a couple coats, everything comes out perfect. Now, you notice also that it's laminated, and you could tell immediately because you have these kind of things, right? This is natural wood would have a slight variation, and when it's laminated, you can really see it on the back here more clearly. You can see the strips that it's made up of, and of course, the horizontal ones. Now, something to keep in mind with laminated is that, of course, I produced a couple, quite a few extras of these blanks, and the reason for that is because I want to be able to pick the best ones out of what happens. Because you have to remember, this is real wood. So, again, I just picked this from the random pile of plaques that I made. So this one happens to have a knot over here. I think that's the only spot there's a knot. And this one here, which I ended up not using, It looks totally fine. I just see a couple of defects that I wasn't too crazy about, so I ended up just putting that in the pile of stuff that I don't use. Here you have a knot here, you have a knot here, and you have a knot here. So you have 3 knots on this one here. If I was to laser engrave it, none of the knots are in the way. For this one here, since it's vertical, again, none of the knots would have been in the way. So it would have been, you know, a pretty good contender to actually become a plaque. And it might still become one later in the future. But I can't choose where the knots will be and not be. And I can't choose the density of the knots, and I can't choose the size of the knots. So when it comes to laser engraving, as I mentioned earlier, it's based on material density. So if I happen to have a knot, let's say, it's easier to see it when I actually have a laser engraved version. So if I happen to have like a very large knot, let's say right over here, the 2025, it might affect how you can actually see the plaque. And again, I can't control the knots. So sometimes I engrave into a knot and it's totally fine, it's legible, you can see it very clearly. And other times when I engrave a knot or something just doesn't work out, it's because of the placements of the densities. It's not something I could preview, it's something that just happens, and you know, that's why I make extras. Laser engraving has a lot of distinct advantages over CNC routering. You have basically infinite resolution, which is nice. But the challenge with lasers is that they also have no two-way feedback system. What I mean by that is the laser is just shooting power or shooting energy down into the material is burning. It has really no idea what it's doing. And if you use too much power, you go deeper, and if you only use enough power, you don't go deep enough. Now, to make it a little bit more challenging, is the material I'm engraving here is wood, and wood has different densities. So let's say you're using the same power going across the whole plaque. And the problem with that is some areas will go deeper, some areas will not go as deep. So that's why you saw me make a whole bunch of extra plaques. And by doing that, when I do the laser engraving, if I happen to hit an area that just doesn't engrave very well, let's say a knot or something like that, I could just switch it over for another plaque. And that's the most efficient way to produce a whole bunch of plaques for the customer for this specific project without making a lot of scrap. Now, the nice thing about laser engraving is that each plaque, of course, is different. And the nice thing about that is that they can be customized however you want. Now, let's say you have, you know, in this case here, just say fire departments. If you have 5 or 6 different fire departments, they can all have different logos, different text, different layout, different everything. The specs can be different, but it's still, you know, all works together for this thing. Now, because I routed these here in the shop, these plaques can be any size, any thickness that you wanted. Of course, we can laminate these to be thicker. So let's say you wanted this to be, I don't know, 6 feet by 6 feet. This thickness would probably not work too well. Then I'd probably make something 2 to 3 times thicker. Of course, it'd be heavier as well. And then we could laser engrave and do all the details too. So with my company, we fabricate everything in the shop, so that gives us absolute flexibility on everything. Now, let's just say worst comes to worst, we couldn't find a laminated acacia to do this. Then we just switch to another wood species like oak, maple, sycamore, tulip, you know, it never really ends. So if you're looking for custom plaques, any size, any shape, any material, any sort of engraving details on it, contact me at CNCKing.com. We'll make them for you and ship them right to your door.